Welcome to Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Kallos, and I represent City Council District 5, which includes the Upper East Side, Midtown East, East Harlem, and Roosevelt Island. Today I'd like to talk about the development of superscrapers throughout New York City. Lately we're seeing more and more tall buildings being built throughout the city, and the developments are encroaching on our residential neighborhoods. Unfortunately, these developments are out of scale with our neighborhoods, do not fit community needs, and would have a variety of negative effects, including casting shadows on our parks. In my district, the development of a 900-foot tower is threatening the Sutton area, a historic residential area on the Upper East Side. As a result, residents and community members of the Sutton area have mobilized in partnership with my office to prevent the construction of this tower and amend zoning in the area to fit community needs. The following conversation will provide a look at the accidental skyline, zoning history and laws, and how the Sutton area has organized against superscrapers. Joining me today to discuss this issue are Mike Ernst, the Director of Planning at the Municipal Arts Society, Rachel Levy, a Preservation and Planning Associate at Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts, and Dieter Seelig, the President of the Sutton Area Community. Thank you all for being here today. Would you mind introducing yourselves, starting with Mike?
Hi, my name is Mike Ernst. Thank you so much for having me this morning. I'm really excited to talk about this subject. So I am the Planning Director at the Municipal Arts Society, or MAS. MAS is a 123-year-old advocacy group. We've been involved in a long history in New York City, from the creation of the original zoning code to the preservation of Grand Central. And then also on the topic we're talking about today, very tall buildings, we have been involved for example, around Central Park, the Time Warner Center. MAS has a long history there, so I really look forward to talking about this subject.
Thank you. Rachel?
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Ben. I'm Rachel Levy. I'm Preservation and Planning Associate at Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts. We were founded in 1982, and we're an independent, not-for-profit membership organization dedicated to preserving the architectural legacy, livability, and sense of place on the Upper East Side. We've been involved with neighborhood planning and zoning issues. Really, since our founding, we helped achieve contextual zoning in the neighborhood in the 1980s, and we've continued to be an active participant in land use and preservation discussions since then. So thank you.
And last but certainly not least, Dieter.
My pleasure to be here. I'm Dieter Seelig, the President of Sutton Area Community, a community organization that serves the East Side between 52nd and 59th Street. And we represent about 100 merchants, about 10,000 people, and have a membership of about 1,000 people and families that enjoy a wonderful lifestyle in a sort of specific area that we're trying to preserve without the encroachment of a 1,000-foot tower. So I'm here to represent my community to talk about that.
Thank you very much. So let's get things started. What's this accidental skyline?
Well, thank you. So the External Skyline is a project that MAS began in 2013, and this was in response to a series of proposed and buildings that are now under construction, a very tall residential towers along the south edge of Central Park, mostly along 57th Street. And what MAS did was look at these proposed buildings and model them. We created images just showing what they, using the best information we had at the time, what they were going to look like, and then showed the impacts. So these buildings, because they are extraordinarily tall, in fact, some of these buildings are the tallest buildings in New York City. You could argue that one of them, where the new Nordstrom's will be, is actually taller by roof height than One World Trade. So we looked at not only what the buildings are going to look like, but the process of how they're being built. And we have been quite pleased that this has gotten tremendous traction, that even 2 years later, people still continue to speak about this. And what's interesting is that we're seeing new buildings come up that even 2 years ago weren't proposed.
And what kinds of buildings are being built along 57th Street?
So what's different about this generation of super talls is, unlike previous history of New York, where the tallest buildings were like the Empire State Building, or before that the Chrysler Building, those were largely commercial buildings. They were commercial office towers built by corporations to kind of point to their tremendous wealth. This is different in that these are residential towers, which means they have a different typology, they have a different way that they're built. These are very tall residential towers with usually just 1 or 2 units per floor that are geared towards a very high-end luxury market.
And so 57th Street is 2 blocks south of Central Park. What is going to be the impact of these super tall buildings on Central Park?
Well, that's one of the things we looked at. So in modeling these new buildings, we also modeled what would be the impact of the shadows on the park. And shadows and access to sunlight, this is an issue for people who use parks, of course, that you want the park to be accessible and to be welcoming and friendly to folks. And these buildings are permanent, more or less. I mean, so what we did was model the shadows in these buildings because they are extraordinarily large, cast very large shadows. And most importantly, the point we were making is that we need to think of these collectively, that you can't look at these buildings individually, you need to measure their collective impact.
And in terms of this, so where did these super tall buildings come from, and what are these zoning lot mergers, and what's
Sure.
going on here?
So the way that these buildings get built is what's called as of right, meaning that they conform to the zoning rules and don't have to go through public review or environmental review. And the way that they get to be so extraordinarily tall is that the developers purchase air rights from adjacent buildings. So if I own a building and it's underbuilt, meaning it's less floor area than the zoning allows, you can take the difference and sell it to your neighbor. And if you buy those air rights from a bunch of people, you can stack them all up, and that's how you get these very large buildings.
And how can people find out about air rights?
Sure. So as part of this project, so we had a first initial report about 57th Street. We did a follow-up project which, using some open data that the City of New York produces called Map Pluto, we took the buildings and looked at how big they were and how big they were allowed under the zoning and mapped that difference. So we created maps citywide of available air rights in New York. And so you can go to our website at mas.org and you can click on where you work or where you live and see if there's available air rights there.
And that's also where they can read the Accidental Skyline Report?
Yes.
And that website address again is?
mas.org.
That's incredibly simple.
Yeah.
And so as part of this, it seems like the rules that govern this are the zoning laws.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to go over to our friends of the Upper East Side Historic District to tell us a little bit about zoning and why we have it.
Sure. Well, zoning is really the three-dimensional blueprint for our city. So it's what helps determine the size, shape, and even location of new construction. And I think an interesting fact is that zoning really was developed to ensure access to quality of life issues like light and air for New Yorkers. So toward the end of the 19th century, the 1870s, the 1880s, the city was getting denser. There was a lot of immigration. There was a great deal of construction at that time, and New Yorkers began to protest the loss of light and air. So this is a time when we started to see new laws coming into effect, things that would preserve these amenities for residents. So we saw laws coming in that would require a window in every room, for example, or an air shaft to let a small amount of light at least into a unit.
And so when did this zoning law really come into effect and why?
Sure. Well, as construction technology advanced, there was the advent of steel frame construction. Buildings were able to grow taller and taller. The situation became more severe. And the tipping point was the construction of the Equitable Building. So this was a building constructed in Lower Manhattan in 1915, and it was massive for its time. It was 42 stories, and it rose straight up from the street with no setbacks to a height of around 540 feet. It was so large that it cast a 7-acre shadow around the entire area, casting the entire neighborhood into darkness. And this really affected even the value of neighboring buildings, which no longer had access to sunlight. So this directly helped lead to the establishment of New York City's 1916 zoning resolution, which established height and setback controls as well as different categories of use districts. So residential districts were separated from uses which were deemed incompatible, like manufacturing. The other really huge thing that the 1916 zoning resolution did is that it produced buildings that conform to what we sometimes call a wedding cake typology. So if you think of the Empire State Building, this is a classic example. So you can picture the large sort of bulky base topped by a series of setback levels capped by a thin spire. And so this type of building allowed a lot more light and air to access the street.
Wow. And so the Equitable Building is still there today
It
at
is.
120 Broadway.
Correct.
So people can go and see it for themselves. Now we call that area the Canyon of Heroes. And so are we still stuck with this 1916 zoning code, or is it changing? Can we change it?
So it's changed a lot over time. By the 1950s, planners realized that if the city were to be built out at the density that was allowed by the 1916 zoning resolution, the city would have had a capacity for 55 million people, which is just way more than the city could realistically handle. At the time, planners were also heavily influenced by the construction of the Seagram Building in 1958, which itself was inspired by Le Corbusier's Tower in the Park style development. So as you can picture, the Seagram Building on Park Avenue, it's sort of a thin setback tower surrounded by a plaza. And so this became the sort of model of the 1961 zoning resolution, and these ideas were implemented in 1961.
So I keep hearing the word density and also FAR. And I think these are two complex words that most people don't know about. Can you tell me a little bit about
Definitely.
what both of those words mean?
Sure. So FAR was introduced, the concept was introduced in the 1961 zoning resolution.
And what does FAR stand for?
So it stands for floor area ratio, and it was introduced as a way to limit density so that we didn't end up with a city of 55 million people. So what it is a ratio between the total building area and the lot area of the zoning lot. So each zoning district has an FAR, which if you multiply it by the area of the zoning lot, produces the maximum amount of density that could be built on that site. So for example, if you have a zoning lot that's 10,000 square feet and the FAR is 1, that means that 10,000 square feet is the total amount of building, the maximum amount of density that could be constructed on that lot. It's sort of flexible. It can be all one story covering the entire lot for 10,000 square feet, or it could be, 2 stories covering half the lot, 4 stories covering a quarter of the lot.
And how did communities around New York City respond to the new 1961 zoning resolution?
Sure.
And what is contextual zoning?
Well, so people in communities across the city really began to feel the negative effects of tower in the park style developments and also sliver towers that resulted from the 1961 zoning. So often they were urban renewal projects. An example from the Upper East Side is Rupert Towers from the 1970s. And these buildings really were at odds with their existing communities. They were much taller, they were set back from the street, they didn't conform to the existing streetscape. So groups like Friends of the Upper East Side and others came together and asked the city for an alternative. And that's how contextual zoning districts were developed and began to be mapped across the city. So in contrast to height factor zoning, like the Seagram Building example, contextual zoning offers buildings that conform to the existing streetscape. So they use things like height limits to keep the buildings in line with their neighbors. They're required to have higher lot coverage. Often they even have higher density than a height factor building would. And so they encourage buildings that just sort of conform more to the historic streetscape and have been a great solution for a lot of communities.
So contextual zoning is kind of like a height cap. So they have different numbers. Some of them are R8B
Yes.
or R10A. What are the heights that are limited under an R10A, which I think is the highest density, or an R8B, so folks know what that really means when they hear both of those numbers?
Sure. So the contextual zoning districts, as you said, are the ones with the letters after them. So R8B, R10A, R9X are some examples. And 2 of the most common contextual districts used in Manhattan are R8B and R10A. So R8B really is your typical mid-block residential character. It has a height cap of 75 feet. It's required to cover 70% of the zoning lot. And it's required to align with the existing street wall. So these new buildings while they may be new in character and in materials, should roughly sort of fit into the existing streetscape. They have an FAR of 4 in R8B districts, so that means on a typical mid-block lot, let's say it's 25 feet by 100 feet, so the zoning lot is 2,500 square feet multiplied by 4. That means the maximum amount of building that could be on that lot is 10,000 square feet. R10A is common along the avenues. It produces sort of a bulkier, tall but not tower-like building, and the height cap on those is 210 feet. But after 150 feet, they're required to set back. So again, they are tall, but they conform with the sort of context on the avenues.
And how can people who are watching learn more about contextual zoning and other land use tools that they can use?
Sure. Well, Friends recently released a report about different land use tools that are in effect in our neighborhood on the Upper East Side and could be applicable in lots of other neighborhoods across the city. And we've also made some recommendations about different ways to preserve neighborhood character beyond just historic districts and really incorporating some of these zoning tools. So that report is called The Upper East Side, A Framework for the Future of 5 Neighborhoods, and it's available on our website.
Thank you so very much for that work, and I was proud to have a chance to provide some sponsorship from that along with many other people through member item funding from my office, and please continue to keep up the great work.
Thank you.
And so we have an idea of what the problem is from the accidental skyline. We have an idea of what one of the solutions can be, in fact, the solution from our zoning code from our Friends of the Upper East Side Historic District. And so let's talk to Dieter Seelig at Sutton Area Community about what they've been doing when they had to deal with this. So you find out around Easter that they want to put up a 900-foot tower in your neighborhood. What did you start to do, and what can the community do and learn from your example? So what's the first thing you should do when you find out that a big building is coming to your residential neighborhood that probably doesn't belong there?
Thank you. The first thing you have to gauge is how upsetting this whole project is, because you cannot imagine, I cannot imagine a 1,000-foot tower in our neighborhood. Every building is 20 stories or 13 stories or 6 stories. So a 1,000-foot tower is just beyond my comprehension. And when I got the first call and somebody said there'll be a building going up on our block on 58th Street, I wasn't particularly concerned until I found out that there was actually already a marketing plan out there that says we're going to be selling apartments in this 1,000-foot tower. And I said, it's impossible to have a 1,000-foot tower. So then I brought it to our board, and they seem to be nonplussed about development. Developments are normal in New York City. It's just that when you find out it's a 1,000-foot tower in what is a mid-block area, in a one-way street, all of a sudden everybody got upset about it, and understandably so, and people have different concerns, perfectly normal concerns, like what about sanitation, what about the fire department, what about the traffic? While the construction is going on, when there's children and older people in the street, how are they going to be affected? And so that then produced enough people to voice an opinion. And it happened to be that Councilmember Kallos was at our Easter egg hunt in our little park at the end of 57th Street. And I mentioned that this was a possibility, and he picked it up right then and there. And we've been working on it ever since to try to find a way to modify it. Nobody's really opposed to the development, but we're all upset about a 1,000-foot tower.
So, and I recall that one of our first steps was to organize and collect signatures and email addresses, so we had a group of people that we could mobilize. Could you tell us a little bit about the petition gathering, getting several thousand signatures in just a week or two, and how
Yes.
that all happened and why that's important?
Well, there are certainly two parts to it. Once we knew we had support on the political side of things, we then had to show that there was a real genuine community support. And through our email campaign and word of mouth, people found out that there's something they can do about it, because the first reaction is that, well, there's nothing you can do about it, particularly when they call it as of right. And then somebody said, well, what's this as of right mean? Where's our rights as a community, and how can we do something about that? So the petition drive took relatively little time. We got a couple of thousand signatures in a relatively short time. In such a densely inhabited area, it wasn't all that difficult, particularly since this was such an overwhelming project. So Councilmember Kallos created his website petition, and we've been working ever since. We're still doing it. Through the month of October, we have set up a table at the corner of 57th and 1st Avenue. And we collected 300 signatures on Saturday in a couple of hours for four weeks in a row by volunteers who do nothing but talk about it. And the people are saying, I'm perfectly happy to sign for that because I really don't want that tower here.
And so we've been able to use that mailing list to bring out the community on numerous occasions. What was the first big meeting that you had, and how did you get that together in order to make it happen?
The first big meeting was actually set up by an organization that was created relatively quickly because we needed to have support from CB6, Community Board 6, which is our district, and they were kind enough. Well, actually, they had a hearing scheduled, a zoning hearing that was then initiated by the developer, and the developer backed out. And I had found out that this was an agenda item and talked to Community Board 6. And I said, well, even so, they have backed out. We as community would like to be heard. And they set up the meeting in Langone on 1st Avenue. And we appeared with about 250, 300 people there. And a very vocal group of residents, and many of them have lived there most of their life, wanted to speak about it and tell somebody how they felt about it. And goodness gracious, there were people from CB6. They had no idea what was going to, how this was going to turn out, because it was almost revolutionary, because people were not shy about it. Not just the strength of numbers, individuals came up and spoke about how they feel about this development and what can be done about it. And nobody felt that they are powerless. So they felt that they have power if they can speak up, and there's somebody who will listen to them. That produced a resolution.
And so I think one thing to learn from this is make sure you're subscribed to your community board newsletter. You know what's going on a monthly basis, and then turn out, ask for that resolution. So you got that resolution. They've asked for contextual height caps in your neighborhood, and they've asked the City Planning Commission to change the zoning. But in the interim, you've been organizing through a whole new vehicle to do something about it yourself.
Yes.
If you can tell us a little bit about it and how people can learn about it and what you're doing there.
Yes, it needed also an organized legal push. It wasn't just the people's voices. Somebody need to formulate that. Somebody need to put this into some kind of a presentable form to the Planning Commission and to eventually to the mayor. So the East River 50s Alliance was created that Sutton Area Community is a part of. And other people have joined the organization, other community organizations have joined it. And they were lucky enough or organized enough to create funds with which they organized a legal drive by a law firm that has zoning experts and a PR firm. All of which then coordinated the efforts of us as a community and the interests of certain buildings. There were building organizations, board of directors that have joined the organization, contributed some money, and they have now formulated a presentable plan to the City Planning Commission, and they've gone to present that. The City Planning Commission has made some comments, and they modified it in the right direction so that it'll be presentable and have a chance of success. And so in the next 3 or 4 weeks, it will be presented and finally will be hopefully accepted by the Planning Commission.
And so just in summary, you were able to bring a private application to the City Planning Commission, which is still in progress. And we actually, I remember going building by building. We do Ben in Your Building with Sutton Area Community as well as the East River 50s Alliance to really build the membership and raise the funds to pay for this zoning change. And each individual in our city has a chance to be able to do this. And you've actually led the fight, and I just want to thank you. You're a model for our city and any community that is seeing their neighborhood change in a way that they're not okay with. So I just want to thank folks, and if you want to learn more about it, you can go to eastriver50salliance.org, spelled out. And thank you all three for everything you've done for the Municipal Arts Society, identifying the problem and the fact that we've got an accidental skyline and we've got zoning and development on autopilot, and to the Friends of the Upper East Side Historic District for all of your great work in the past and today, empowering people and teaching them about the zoning code and how to change it and bring context to their neighborhoods, and to Sutton Area Community and Dieter for leading the charge and building the East River 50s Alliance. This has been a great discussion, and I'd like to thank my guests for providing their insights into this important topic. For questions on this or any other issue impacting our district, you can contact me directly using the information on your screen. I'm City Council Member Ben Kallos, and I thank you for watching Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network.